SQL or SQL is the most popular language used by databases. It's frequently going to be used by websites and apps, and it can store basically any type of data that you can think of. They might be, settings, errors, even credentials, passwords. There's a lot of information that gets stored in databases, and that's some pretty juicy data. So if you want to be a cybersecurity professional, you're going to want to know how to analyze a SQL database. Let's start first with what is SQL. SQL or SQL, as I mentioned before, it's the structured query language. This is basically a language which is used to communicate with databases. So this language is used to send data, to send a request to a database. The database will process that request, and then it will send back its data. So it'll look something like this. We've got the database here on the right side, and then we use a SQL query, which is a set of text, which is going to be sent over a computer network, and it's going to be compliant with the SQL syntax. And that's going to be used to tell the database what to do. So right now we have this select star from Moz_hosts. And this is saying, hey, get me all the data from Moz hosts. And then the database will respond back with all of the data from Moz hosts. That's basically what it's doing, right? SQL is just the language that is used to communicate with the database. In this example, we just use it to grab some data. We could also use a different query to update or delete some data. Now, if you are not very familiar with what SQL databases are, you could basically imagine them as fancy spreadsheets. So databases are made up of tables, and when you actually try to visualize these tables, they're going to look like this. So this is Moz hosts. You can see that we've got 3 columns here. They're called ID, host, and frequency. And then we've got some rows, and in every single row is an item that is being stored. This might look very, very similar to like an Excel spreadsheet or a Google Sheet. And that's the way you should probably imagine it. Databases, and SQL databases in particular, are very fancy ways of storing this type of spreadsheet information extremely efficiently. So it's going to use up less space than a normal Excel spreadsheet. And it's also going to be way faster to make an update or to search for a specific item in the database than if you tried to do that with a spreadsheet. So that's the reason why people use databases. And I've got another example here. This is a different table in a SQL database. And you can see here we've got an ID field, a URL field, and a title field. Now, typically, you're going to see databases have this ID column, and that ID column is very frequently used to reference other records in other tables. So every single item in each table has to have the same fields. And so if you want to store sets of different data and you want to be able to refer to each other, then you need to use these IDs. So for example, let's just say you're making a social media website and you need to be able to store users and you need to be able to store the comments that those users make. Now, the information, the fields that you have for a user will be like the name, the email address, the hashed password. You'll have all of those fields, and every single record in that user table will represent one user. Now, when a user makes a post, a comment, well, now you need to store that information, but that can't go into the user table because every time someone makes a post, that isn't a new user. That's a completely different thing that has different values, different fields. And so you might have a posts table, which contains a column for the actual text of what they submitted. And maybe it also contains the ID of the user that posted it, so that you know that this post came from this user. So that's an important thing to realize, is that the IDs that you will see in these tables will oftentimes actually be used to refer to a different, so another table could use that to refer to each other. So we'll see an example of that in our demo today. But just imagine databases are just Excel spreadsheets. All right, so let's go into some basics of how SQL works. Today's episode is not about trying to teach you how SQL works. It's more of just focusing on specifically how do you analyze a SQL database. So I'm only going to go through the SQL language just so that you have a baseline understanding, but this is definitely not the place to go over how to do SQL. It's a much longer episode to cover that. So right now we have a query on the left side here. Select star from Moz hosts where ID equals 2. So that's going into our database, and then our database has a table called Moz hosts. So let's break this request down. The very first part of this request is this select word. Select is the verb, and that's the term that is used in SQL to indicate what type of operation we're doing. So in this case, select means we want to get some data. And then we have a star. Now the star means get all of the columns. If you didn't have the star here, what you would do is you would actually list out which columns you wanted. So maybe you only wanted the ID column, or maybe you only wanted the host column. You could choose which columns you wanted. The star specifically says, get me all of the columns. The next part is the from, and this indicates which table is being queried. So when we saw our original database, we actually saw 2 different tables. And so when we run a query against the database needs to know which table are you looking at, because I've got a bunch. And the from says, I'm going to tell you which one I'm looking for. And that immediately is followed by Moz hosts, which is the name of the table that we're looking for. You can see that here in the yellow label. And then right now our query is just saying, get me all the columns from this table, from the Moz host table. And then we have where. Where is indicating that I've got some search parameters. So if we actually ended our request, our SQL statement at Moz hosts here, this would actually just give us all of the records in the database. All the records in the table. But what we're doing with where is we're saying we're actually going to limit, so we're not going to get everything. And we only want to get records where ID equals 2. And hopefully you can guess which record that's going to be. That's going to be this google.com record here. And then we've got a semicolon. All SQL statements are going to end in a semicolon. That's how the database knows that you're done with your statement here. So this is just a very, very brief overview. If you want to dive way more into this, I would highly recommend the W3 Schools SQL tutorial. I've got a link here. If you literally just go and Google W3 Schools and SQL, you'll be able to find it very quickly. It's a free resource. It has descriptions of all of the different verbs and commands that are going to be involved with SQL, and it's a good way to learn. They actually have a tool where you can try out some SQL statements without having to set up your own database. It's really nice. All right, so let's get into the meat of the potatoes and talk about actually doing the analysis. I'm going to outline a couple methods here that you can use to do the analysis. The very most straightforward way of doing it is running a SQL query directly against the database. So if you've got access to the database, learn SQL and run your queries against the database. That will require some SQL knowledge, and if you're trying to get up and running really quickly, you might not want to spend the couple days it takes to get pretty familiar with SQL in order to solve whatever the problem is that you have. You could probably Google and find some Stack Overflows for specific queries that you want, but it'll be very tedious if you don't know how to use SQL whatsoever, and you're just constantly having to Google and find out how to run different commands. So that's definitely the recommended way if you know SQL. Another way that you could do it is you could transfer the SQL data over to a SIEM like Splunk or Elastic. Now, this substitutes your problem. You don't need to use SQL, so you don't need to have SQL experience, a SQL familiarity, but now you need to have familiarity with your SIEM, so whether that's Splunk or Elastic. Now, for some people, this can actually be a way better investment of their time. If you're trying to be a cyber analyst, you probably will want to be familiar with tools like Splunk or Elastic. And so being able to transfer that data over into Splunk or Elastic and learning how to run the queries there, because you know that it's not just SQL data that you'll have to analyze, it's JSON data, it's CSVs, it's all these different types of data sources that you're going to need to learn how to analyze, and learning a common query, learning how to use just one program to do all of that is going to be a good investment of your time. I would recommend it in that case. This is probably going to be the most time consuming setup out of all of the options I'm going to list here, because it will require you to install and set up Splunk or Elastic or any other SIEM. And it will also require you to download some sort of plugin, some sort of tool that will ingest the data from the SQL database into your SIEM program. So that's probably the most time consuming setup of any of these options. But if you want to be a cyber analyst, that's probably a good way to go. Another way to do it, I mentioned that you could think about SQL databases as spreadsheets. Well, it turns out you can actually download SQL data into a spreadsheet. And then from there, you can look at it in Excel. And if you're just trying to find out some very basic information like, hey, how many times does this IP address show up in the log? Or you just want to, do some basic calculation that way, you might be able to do that entirely from Excel and save yourself all the fuss of trying to learn SQL or trying to set up a SIEM and learn how to use a SIEM. Again, it's going to depend on what makes sense for you. If you really want to be a cyber analyst, I would recommend learning how to use a SIEM. And then my last method here that I'd recommend is you can actually find a software viewer that you can just straight up drag and drop your SQL database into. And this only works if you have a copy of the SQL database itself. It doesn't work if you've got the SQL database in, like it's something that you're accessing remotely. The same thing applies for the previous one as well, in terms of exporting the SQL database. But if you do happen to have a copy of the entirety of the database, well, you can export it as a spreadsheet, or you can analyze it in a software viewer. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. So I'm going to go through a demo, and we're going to do these two things. And I'm going to touch on that first item, on this first method on here to run queries directly on the database very briefly, just to show you what that looks like. But I'm going to show you how to solve some challenges and actually do the analysis by just quickly getting the data out of the database and analyzing it using a different tool that doesn't require a lot of experience to learn. So let's go into the demo. If you've got any questions as we go through the demo, please ask it in the chat. All right, so I'm over here now, and I've got my Kali VM. Gonna log in here, and I've got a SQL database I want to analyze from the practice gym. And what we've got here is a Firefox SQLite history database. And we need to answer some questions about what happened in this person's search history. So turns out that actually Firefox stores all of your like bookmarks, all of your history, all of your, I think your search queries as well, in a SQL database. And if someone is able to steal your laptop, or maybe they're able to somehow somehow like install something on your computer that will be able to pull data off some malware, they can pull out your search history. It seems like something that you want to be aware of, that it's actually just being stored in a SQL database. I don't want to pick on Firefox here though, because all browsers are going to be storing your data, your search history somewhere on your computer. Might not necessarily be a SQL database, but that's a very common way that it is done. And we've got a series of questions here, and we've also got a access to a VM to play around with the SQL database from the command line. So we've got a couple options here for what we want to do. We can play around with the SQL database directly within the platform here, or we can download the SQL database and play with it on our Kali machine. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to hit this download button. All right, it's there in my downloads. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to navigate to my downloads directory, and then I can see here that's my SQLite database. Move that to my desktop, and now we can start playing around with it. So let's look at what questions were being asked. Being asked, what did the user search for on Craigslist? What was the price of Bitcoin when the user was browsing? What Bitcoin exchange did the user log into? So we're definitely going to need to crack open this database. I'm going to start first by trying to crack it open using SQLite, because we can see here there's a .SQLite file extension. And I think if I run the file command as well, it should tell me this is a SQLite3.x database. So if I run SQLite3, I will be able to connect to the SQL database. I'm going to minimize this for now. And if you are trying to run your own analysis using SQL directly, the first thing that I would recommend is in a SQLite database, actually in all SQL databases, you want to figure out what tables are there, because right now we have no clue what's here. In SQLite, you can actually figure out what tables are in the database by typing .tables and then hitting enter. And this will give us the names of all of the tables in the database. If you do .hint or .help, it will actually tell you what different SQLite commands you can run. So these are not actual SQL queries. These are SQLite. SQLite is the type of database. These are SQLite commands which tell the SQLite program how to or what to do. So it's not actually running a query. It's just saying, hey, I want to see all the tables. So let's go look back at the tables, and we can see here that we've got quite a few. The question that we're being asked is, what did the user search for on Craigslist? That probably indicates to me that I want to be looking at the different URLs that are going to be in that database, because maybe one of those URLs has a search query parameter. And if I look at my options here, I've got some bookmarks. I don't know what Anos is. Favicons, that's like the tiny icon that you'll see in the tab in your browser. But I can see here that there's probably like 3 places that might be interesting to look at, maybe 4. History, visits, hosts, keywords, and places. Input history sounds like some sort of like keystrokes that it's looking at. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the command that we saw in our example on the slides. So I'm going to do select star Moz hosts semicolon. I'm going to see what we get. What we get is the fact that I missed the from keyword. So select star from Moz hosts, and we can see here these are all the websites that were visited. Now these are not URLs; these are just the domain names. So we don't actually know what queries were made on these websites. We just know that the user visited these websites. So this isn't where we want to be. We want to look somewhere else. Let's check out history visits. This is a bunch of numbers, so that's not going to help us. We're actually looking for some text. So this listing of numbers is probably not very helpful. Let's look at keywords next. History keywords. Looks like it's empty, it's blank. How about Moz places? All right, now we're actually seeing something which might be interesting here. It looks like we're getting some URLs. It looks like we're getting some titles. There's definitely some information here. Maybe this is where we can find what we want. If you're using SQLite, what you can do if you don't know what these columns are is run the .schema command and then the name of the table. And that will tell you what each column is. And so we're looking at Moz places. So I'm going to do schema Moz places. And I can see here we've got Moz places. There's an integer, which is the key. There's a URL. There's a title, a rev host, whatever that is, visit count, an indication if it's hidden, typed, integer, default, not null, favicon ID. So there's some interesting information here. What I'm primarily interested in is we just want the URL because maybe the search query is within the URL. So I think we're kind of done here now for showing how to run SQL. I mentioned that we're gonna have some methods to do this analysis without using SQL. So let's actually go and jump for that. We know what we're trying to do. We're going to be looking at this Moz places table, and we're going to look at the URLs and see if any of those URLs are giving any information that reveal what this person was searching for. We have their search history. We want to know what interesting things they've searched for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the first method of being able to import your SQL database into another program, a SQL database viewer, to analyze. And so I'm going to do a very, very easy method. I'm just going to go on Google. I'm going to type in SQL, online SQLite viewer. And what do you know? There is a website where we can legit just drag and drop our SQL database and it will analyze it for us. One quick note, when you're using these online tools, be very wary of what they're doing with your data. In this case, because this is a challenge that I just downloaded from the internet and it's not my data, I don't really care about it. So if I upload this information in here and they keep that information, doesn't really matter. But if you were to upload your own Firefox SQL search history onto one of these websites, you don't really know, are they saving that information and selling it to someone, and now someone has your search history? So be very careful when you're using these random online tools. Don't upload information that is going to be sensitive, and definitely do it from a virtual machine, because you definitely don't want to get yourself a virus if you're going to these random websites that you've never heard of. I'm literally connected to someone's GitHub. So this is just like some random person, it looks like. Yeah, some random person who put this project together. I don't know if this has malware or not. That's why I'm doing it in a Kali VM. So we've got our viewer here on the left side, and I'm just going to straight up drag and drop from our desktop our SQLite database. And what this viewer will let us do is flip between the different tables and see what's inside them. So if I go to, what were we looking at? We're looking at history visits, I believe. No, that wasn't the one. We were looking at, I'm losing it. Moz places. That's where we're looking. All right. So this is Moz places, and we can tab through and look at all of the results. And if we did not know how to use SQLite or SQL and run queries and all of that, just by dragging and dropping this SQL database into this viewer will solve all those problems for us. We don't know what tables are in this database. Cool, there's a drop down here. I can select what table I want to look at. We don't know what the columns are in this database. Well, this viewer is telling us right away. We don't need to figure it out. So that's very helpful. We need to be looking at Craigslist queries, because the question was asking, what did the user search for on Craigslist? So let's look at the Craigslist queries. I can see here, can I expand this? No, I cannot expand this. All right, let's full screen this and take a look here. So it looks like on the left, in this URL, this is literally every single website, web page this individual is viewing. And you can see here they went to Google, and then from Google they went to Craigslist. And then from Craigslist, it looks like they got redirected to the Baltimore Craigslist. You can see here, Baltimore jobs, apartments, personnels for sale services. Okay, so they're on the Baltimore Craigslist. And here, look, there's a Baltimore Craigslist slash search. So this is a search that they made. And you can see here, query equals Bitcoin. So they searched for Bitcoin. So if I go over here, I can just see that they were searching for Bitcoin on Craigslist. And now we're being asked, what's the current price of Bitcoin when the user was browsing? Well, conveniently enough, just two options below, the title of this website has the price of Bitcoin at the time that they were looking. So this is $239.50. Wow, that must have been a good time to buy. Or maybe not. I don't know at what point in the future you all are watching this, but as of right now, it would have been great if you bought it at 239.50 for one Bitcoin. Bitcoin's now like $20,000, $30,000, something like that. So 239 bucks, good price. We got another question here for what exchange did they log into? So this is a question that we can definitely answer from the websites that are that we can see here. You might think initially that maybe the answer is Bitstamp, because Bitstamp is a place where you can buy and sell Bitcoins, and that's an option. But make sure you don't jump too quickly to an answer. Make sure you actually are thorough with looking at the different possibilities and verifying if you are correct, because not only is there Bitstamp, but there is Coinbase. And so there are multiple websites that this individual went to. And if we look at Bitstamp, it looks like the individual just went to the website and didn't really do anything. But then on Coinbase, they go to the sign-in page. And then after they go to the sign-in page, it says your hosted Bitcoin wallet, and then it says my wallet, and this looks like it's the portal for your primary account on Coinbase. So it looks like this is Coinbase is where this individual actually logged in to the website, not Bitstamp. It looks like they just went to the Bitstamp website and then left. They didn't do anything. But on Coinbase, you can see that they went to the sign-in page, and then after they went to the sign-in page, they were dropped off in their accounts page. Oops. So we're going to come over here, and we're going to say that they went to Coinbase, not Bitstamp. Be very careful when answering questions like this. Imagine you're actually doing analysis as a cyber analyst for a data breach that had occurred, or whatever it is. If you're trying to find out some information and you just jump to conclusions at the first sign that you found something that looks like it looks like what you're looking for, you could be incorrect. You could do improper attribution, and that could cause a lot of problems. So always be very cautious. Double check your answer as much as possible. Look at the other data and see if there's anything else that will give you a better indication of what is true and what is not true. So I'm going to go now and switch over to the other method that we had described, which is converting your SQL database into a spreadsheet. And just like we did for the SQLite viewer, I'm going to go to trusty old Google, and I'm going to search for convert SQLite to CSV. And this tutorial will actually give you the few commands that you need to run to go and do this. So I'm going to put this to the side over here, if I can get it to stay. Come on, let's get it to stay. All right. So we need to connect to the database using SQLite. And then what we're going to do is we're going to turn on headers. So headers on, .mode CSV, .output data.csv. I'm literally just typing in what I'm seeing here in the example. And then we run our search query on the table that we want. So let's do select star from, and I'm going to choose a table that's actually going to be relevant to one of the questions that we have to answer. So if I go back to the questions, it's going to ask us, what is the email that was used to log into the exchange? Okay, what was the email that was used to log into the exchange? Let's see if we can find any sort of indication of that. All right. I can see an email address here, so maybe we give this one a shot. This is Moz Places. So we're going to select star from Moz Places and then execute that. So that just searched for everything in Moz Places, and then we're saving that output to data.csv, and then we're going to do .quit. And if we do an ls, we can see we now have a data.csv. Cool. Now, I do not know if I have a spreadsheet viewer on Kali. And I have mousepad. That probably isn't the most helpful tool. Let's see. I'm gonna blank my screen for a second while I log into my Google Drive, and I'm gonna look at it from Google Drive. Drive.google.com. As much as I'm sure you all would love to see what I've got in my Google Drive, I'm gonna keep that hidden. All right, let's go back. So I've now got my data in a Google spreadsheet, Google Sheets, and now we can search. We can look for what we want. Oops. I'm gonna expand this just a little bit here, and we were looking for that email address. So we can see here we've got the titles of the web pages, and we've got this inbox, this Gmail inbox for Big Bird with a 1 at gmail.com. And you can see here, we know that they logged in because they also get a new device confirmation as the title. So they must have logged into that account and triggered the verification from Gmail, and then they saw the email with that information. And that's why we have this title. So now I can go in here, type in Big Bird, and then now we've got a couple other questions to answer. But this is the very like quick and simple of how you can do your analysis without having to learn SQL. Personally, what I prefer is using the viewer like this, because when you are trying to look at each table in a spreadsheet, it's kind of a pain to flip between them. You also have to export every single table one at a time, unless you find a faster way of doing it. But the way that I found is just one at a time. So it's not particularly efficient. I would definitely prefer a much faster way of doing this. But within the SQL database viewer, you can quickly flip between the different database tables, look at all the fields, and switch between them. And then if you get a question that you need to answer that requires something that's a little bit more nuance, like I guess I wouldn't use the word nuance. If you need to do some sort of calculation in terms of like, how many times did this show up? The viewer might not be able to do that, but if you know you need to do that and you know which table you require, well, then you can go and you can export specifically that table, throw that table in a spreadsheet, and then do like an Excel formula to help you solve that problem. So using a combination of these two techniques, you can actually do a lot of analysis on SQL databases without having to learn SQL. The one big caveat though is that you can only do this on databases that are not too big. If you've got a database that's got hundreds of millions of records, your computer is not going to be able to handle opening that giant database in a spreadsheet or trying to upload this into a viewer. It's going to be too much for the computer or the website to handle. and it's not going to work out very well for you. If that's the case, you will need to use one of the other techniques in terms of uploading the database to a seam or running queries directly against the database. But for most of them, which are not massive, like not the entire website's database, but smaller databases, maybe databases that are storing application data, usually you can use a SQLite database viewer to analyze that data. All right, now we've got a couple other questions here that we want to answer. So let's take a look and actually complete this challenge. So we're looking at the next question, which is what is the ID of the Bitcoin transaction that the user looked at? So I think we're probably going to go back to our Moz places, and we're going to be looking for an indication that they visited a specific transaction. So, all right, we're on Coinbase here. Looks like they went to Google, Coinbase, Reddit, and they went to the Bitcoin subreddit. They're looking at their Coinbase settings. This looks like an account ID, so I guess we might have figured out their account ID. And then we can see here, this is a network transaction. So this looks like what the question is asking for. What's the ID of the Bitcoin transaction the user looked at? Now let's confirm our theory. So it looks like this transaction ends in 0053. If we, oops, sorry, was I looking at the right one? Oh no, I was not. Be very careful. The transaction ID is this CD2D7. All right, so let's see if we can find that anywhere else. It looks like after they go to Coinbase, they go to blockchain.info. They run a search for a transaction, and that is CD27D7. Or sorry, CD2D7. So these are the same transactions. So I think this is likely the transaction hash for that Bitcoin transaction. We've got that correct. The next question is asking, what's the total Bitcoin value of all the inputs in the Bitcoin transaction? So let's see if we can actually click on this link that they went to, see if we can get that information. The total BTC value of all the inputs. Total BTC value. So we can see here we've got 2 inputs and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 outputs. And so if we just have these 2 inputs, we could just add them together, right? Oh, actually, maybe this calculates it for us. All right, let's put that in. All right, simple enough. We were able to go to the exact website that this person visited back in, I mean, this transaction is from 2015, so quite a few years ago. I think if we look at some of the other columns, last visit date, so if we do timestamp converter, maybe we can figure out what time they actually went to this website, October 3rd, 2015. And that's slightly after this transaction. So this is July 18th is when this transaction was made of 2015, and then it was viewed on October 3rd of 2015. And now we've got a final question. Which Bitcoin address received the majority of the Bitcoin in the transaction? So if we go back here, we can see this looks like the most Bitcoin. I'm just going to copy this address here and then paste that in. And we completed the challenge. So what we're able to do is take a SQLite database here, run a couple of queries in SQL to kind of show how that works if you know SQL. If you don't know SQL, then what we showed is how you can go about exporting that data from a SQL database, put it into a database viewer so you can analyze it very quickly without having to learn how to use SQL, or how can we export individual tables in the database to a spreadsheet to make it easier to view and do some calculations if you need to do the calculations. But I hope you all found that interesting, and enjoy the rest of your day.